Michael Johnson was a man who believed in hard work and quiet living. He had served his time in the city, working long hours at an office where the only sound was the ticking of clocks and the tapping of keyboards. When he finally retired, all he wanted was peace. He and his wife, Laura, moved into a quiet neighborhood that promised exactly that: peace, order, and a sense of community. The neighborhood was managed by a strict homeowners association, better known as the HOA. Michael did not think much about them in the beginning. He believed they were there to keep the lawns trimmed, the fences painted, and the sidewalks clean. He signed the papers without reading every detail. His only dream was to enjoy his retirement and spend his days close to nature. Behind Michael's house ran a small creek. It wasn't much, just a thin line of water weaving between trees and stones, but it gave him joy. Every morning, he would sit near the creek with a cup of coffee and watch the water move. Sometimes, ducks would come and rest there. Sometimes, children from the neighborhood would chase frogs near the banks. For Michael, the creek was alive. It felt like a friend. But one spring, heavy rains came. The water level rose quickly, and the little creek turned wild. It spilled onto the yards nearby, leaving puddles and muddy patches. Michael watched helplessly as part of his small vegetable garden was ruined. Neighbors complained about wet basements and damaged grass. The HOA sent out warnings about property care, but they offered no real help. Michael thought long about a solution. He remembered his younger years, when he had worked on construction sites during college. He was no engineer, but he understood the basics of building. He began sketching ideas in an old notebook. What if he built a small dam? Nothing big, just a careful wall of stones and wood to control the flow of water. It could slow the creek during heavy rain, protect the yards, and even create a small pond where ducks could swim safely. He shared the idea with Laura one evening. She was surprised but supportive. "Michael, are you sure the neighbors will like it?" she asked gently. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know they won't like their basements flooding again." The next morning, Michael began his project. He wore his old boots, rolled up his sleeves, and started gathering stones. He worked slowly, one step at a time. At first, it looked like nothing more than a pile of rocks, but over weeks, the shape of the dam began to appear. He used wooden beams for support, layered the stones carefully, and sealed the gaps with clay from the creek's edge. Neighbors noticed his work. Some shook their heads, others watched with interest. Children found it exciting and asked questions. Michael explained that he was building something to protect the neighborhood from the water. Most people smiled politely and moved on. A few even offered small help, handing him tools or sharing spare wood. By early summer, the dam was finished. It was not a huge structure, but it was strong and steady. The creek's flow slowed, and a small pond formed behind the wall. Birds gathered near the water. Ducks came back more often. The air seemed cooler and fresher around the new pond. For Michael, it felt like a gift to the community. He invited some neighbors to see it up close. He pointed out how the dam would hold back water during storms and how the pond could serve as a natural space for wildlife. People nodded in agreement. Some praised his effort, saying no one else had tried to solve the flooding problem. For a brief moment, Michael felt proud. He had used his own hands to create something that mattered. But then came the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope stamped with the HOA logo. Michael opened it at the kitchen table, expecting another reminder about lawn trimming. Instead, his eyes widened at the words, "Notice of violation." Unauthorized structure built on community property. Fine, $10,000. Laura gasped when she read it. $10,000. For what? For the dam, Michael whispered, his voice heavy. The HOA claimed that Michael had no permission to alter the creek. They said the dam violated neighborhood rules and could pose a risk to property value and safety. They demanded he remove it immediately or face legal action. Michael felt his stomach sink. All those weeks of effort, the long days of lifting stones and shaping wood, suddenly turned into a source of trouble. He could not believe it. He had built the dam to help, not to harm. That evening, Michael attended the monthly HOA meeting at the community hall. He carried pictures of the dam and notes about its benefits. He wanted to explain his reasons, to show that he had acted for the good of everyone. The meeting was crowded. Neighbors filled the chairs, whispering about the fine. At the front sat the HOA board, 5 people with serious faces. Among them was Robert Smith, the HOA president, a man known for his strictness. Michael stood when it was his turn. He spoke clearly, though his hands trembled slightly. He explained how the creek had flooded before, how his dam could prevent damage, and how it had already attracted wildlife that made the neighborhood more beautiful. He showed the pictures of ducks, the calm water, the clean banks. For a moment, the room was silent. Some neighbors nodded in support. But Robert Smith cleared his throat and said firmly, "Rules are rules. No structures may be built without approval. You acted without permission, and the fine stands." Michael's heart sank. He wanted to argue, but he could see it in Robert's eyes the decision was final. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors came to pat him on the back. They whispered words like, "You tried your best and it's not fair." But sympathy could not erase the $10,000 fine hanging over him. That night, Michael sat by the creek again. The water behind the dam was still, reflecting the stars. He felt both proud and broken. Proud of what he had built, broken by the punishment for trying to help. Laura sat beside him quietly, holding his hand. "Maybe," she said softly, "this isn't the end of the story." Michael looked at the dam, strong and silent in the moonlight. Deep inside, he knew she was right. Something told him that the fight had only just begun. The days after the HOA meeting were heavy for Michael Johnson. He felt like a man carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. Every time he passed the mailbox, his chest tightened, afraid another letter from the HOA might be waiting. His once peaceful retirement now seemed tangled in rules, threats, and numbers written on paper. The dam still stood firm at the edge of the creek, beautiful in its own way, but Michael could no longer look at it with pride. Instead, he saw a target, something the HOA had marked as forbidden. Each stone, each piece of wood he had placed with his hands, now carried the shadow of a $10,000 fine. Laura tried to comfort him. She made his favorite meals, brought him tea in the evenings, and reminded him of the neighbors who supported him. "Not everyone is against you, Michael," she said gently. "Many people like what you built. They see the good in it." But Michael also saw the other side. He noticed how some neighbors avoided eye contact when he walked past. Some whispered in small groups, and he wondered if they were talking about him. He knew how communities worked when rules were broken, people took sides. A week later, another envelope came. It was from the HOA again, repeating the demand, remove the dam or pay the fine. This time, they added a deadline: 30 days. Michael read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. He placed it on the table and stared at it, silent. Laura looked at him with worry. "What will you do?" she asked. Michael sighed. "I don't know." He spent the next few days thinking. He went for long walks near the creek, listening to the soft sound of the water. Sometimes, children played nearby, laughing as they skipped stones across the pond that had formed behind the dam. The sight warmed his heart but also sharpened his pain. He had built something for the good of the neighborhood, yet it was treated like a crime. Finally, Michael decided to speak to the HOA president, Robert Smith, directly. Perhaps, face to face, he could find a way to reason with him. He walked to Robert's house one evening. The lawn was perfect, cut short like a green carpet. The mailbox was freshly painted. Robert himself answered the door, wearing a pressed shirt and a stern expression. "Michael," Robert said, his voice calm but cold. "I expected you might come." "Robert, please," Michael began, choosing his words carefully. "I built the dam to help, not to harm. The flooding was a real problem. You know it? My garden was ruined. Other people had wet basements. The dam controls the water. It protects our homes." Robert crossed his arms. "That may be true, but rules exist for a reason. If everyone builds whatever they want, this community will lose order. Today it's a dam. Tomorrow it could be sheds, fences, or worse. The HOA was created to stop that." Michael felt his chest tighten. "So it doesn't matter if the dam works? If it makes life better?" "It matters that you ignored the rules," Robert replied firmly. "And the board voted. The fine stands." Michael left the house with a heavy heart. He had hoped for understanding but found only walls. As the days passed, letters kept arriving. Each one felt colder than the last. Warnings about legal steps appeared in bold letters. The fine felt like a storm cloud hanging over his home. But not everyone in the neighborhood was silent. One afternoon, Michael was watering his garden when an elderly woman named Martha stopped by. She had lived in the community for decades. "Michael," she said kindly, "I just want you to know I think what you built is wonderful. My basement hasn't flooded once this year. Before the dam, I always had water down there after the rain. You saved me a lot of trouble." Her words gave him a spark of strength. Others followed. A young father named David thanked him for creating a safe place where his children could watch ducks. A middle-aged neighbor named Susan praised how beautiful the creek looked now. Still, their kind words did not erase the pressure from the HOA. Robert and the board sent another notice, this time saying contractors would be hired to remove the dam if Michael didn't do it himself. And if that happened, the cost of removal would be added to his fine. Laura watched her husband grow quieter each day. She worried he was carrying too much inside. One night, as they sat at the table with the latest letter between them, she reached for his hand. "Michael," she said softly, "you don't have to fight this alone. You have neighbors who believe in you. Maybe you should gather them. Speak together, not just as one voice." Michael thought about it. The idea scared him, but it also gave him hope. The following weekend, he invited a few neighbors to his backyard. They sat in lawn chairs, drinking iced tea as the summer sun dipped low. Michael spoke honestly. He told them about the fine, the threats, the pressure. He explained how the HOA refused to listen. To his surprise, people supported him. Martha, the elderly woman, offered to speak at the next meeting. David, the young father, said he could collect signatures for a petition. Susan suggested writing letters to the board. For the first time since the fine, Michael felt less alone. Yet, the HOA did not soften. At the next meeting, when neighbors spoke in Michael's favor, Robert listened politely but dismissed their words. "The issue is not the dam's usefulness," he repeated. "The issue is that it was built without permission." The board nodded in agreement. Their faces were stern, untouched by the voices of the community. Walking home from that meeting, Michael felt something shift inside him. He realized the board would never bend, no matter how many neighbors stood up for him. Rules were their shield, and they would not put it down. That night, Michael sat by the creek again. The moonlight reflected on the water, and the dam stood strong, holding back the current. He ran his hand along the stones he had placed, feeling the rough edges. He thought of the time he spent, the hope he carried, the pride he once felt. Laura joined him quietly. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking," Michael said slowly, "that if they don't want the dam, maybe they should see what life is like without it." His words hung in the air, soft but heavy. Laura looked at him with wide eyes. She knew what he meant, but she did not interrupt. She simply held his hand. The days ahead would test Michael more than ever. The HOA's anger was strong, but something deeper was awakening inside him, something that would change everything. The deadline set by the HOA drew closer with each passing day. Michael Johnson woke each morning to see the dam still standing strong, and each evening he went to bed knowing the letters from the board would not stop until it was gone. The $10,000 fine was like a stone pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Laura noticed how he grew quieter. He no longer laughed when the ducks waddled across their yard or when children shouted in excitement near the pond. Instead, he sat with his coffee, staring at the dam as if trying to decide whether to keep holding on or let go. One morning, the phone rang. It was Robert Smith, the HOA president. His voice was formal, every word sharp and measured. "Mr. Johnson," Robert said, "the deadline is in 10 days. If the dam is not removed by then, the HOA will take action. I must remind you that the costs of removal will be added to your fine." Michael held the phone tightly. For a moment, he thought of arguing again, of explaining the benefits, of reminding Robert of the flooding before the dam. But he stopped himself. He had already tried that. Robert had made his stance clear: rules mattered more than reason. When the call ended, Michael sat at the kitchen table in silence. Laura placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What did he say?" she asked. "The same thing he always says," Michael replied. "Remove it, or pay." That night, Michael could not sleep. He walked outside under the pale moonlight and stood by the creek. The dam looked peaceful, the water calm behind it. He thought about the weeks of work he had put into it, the blisters on his hands, the sweat on his back. He thought about the neighbors who had thanked him, the children who loved the ducks, and the beauty it brought to the place. But he also thought about the fine, the threats, and the constant letters. He thought about Laura, who stayed strong for him but worried every day. He could not let the burden crush them both. By the time the sun rose, Michael had made his decision. He called a few neighbors who had supported him and asked for their help, not to fight, but to bring tools. When they arrived, they were surprised. "You're really going to take it down?" David, the young father, asked. "Yes," Michael said quietly. "They want it gone. So I'll give them what they want." The neighbors looked at one another, uneasy. But they respected his decision. Together, they gathered shovels, crowbars, and ropes. Michael stood in front of the dam, taking a deep breath. "This was built with my hands," he said softly, almost to himself. "And now I'll be the one to take it down." The work was hard, even harder than building it. Each stone he had placed with care now had to be lifted and rolled away. The wooden beams, once strong supports, were pried loose with crowbars. Clay that had sealed the gaps cracked and crumbled. As the first stones came free, the water pressed harder against the weakening wall. The creek, once calm, began to stir with energy. Michael felt a pang in his chest. It was as if the dam itself resisted being destroyed, holding on until the very last moment. Neighbors gathered to watch. Some shook their heads in sadness, others whispered words of encouragement. Martha, the elderly woman who had praised the dam, stood with tears in her eyes. "It was a good thing you built, Michael," she said. "Don't let them make you feel it was wrong." Michael gave her a small nod, though his throat was too tight to speak. By afternoon, most of the dam was gone. Only a few stones and wooden beams remained. The water, now free, rushed forward with force. The pond shrank as the creek reclaimed its old path. Ducks flapped their wings and swam quickly, confused by the sudden change. Finally, Michael pulled out the last support beam. The water surged forward, crashing through the gap with power. The dam collapsed completely, and the creek roared as if it had been waiting for this moment. Michael stepped back, soaked from the spray. His chest ached, but not from the work. It was the ache of watching something he loved destroyed. The dam had been his project, his gift to the neighborhood, and now it was gone, reduced to scattered stones and broken wood. The crowd was silent for a long time. Then Robert Smith appeared, walking down the path with a clipboard in his hand. He looked at the rushing creek, then at Michael. His expression was calm, almost satisfied. "I see you've done what was required," Robert said. "The HOA will take note of your compliance." Michael stared at him, his face unreadable. He did not answer. Robert nodded once, wrote something on his clipboard, and walked away. The neighbors slowly left too, leaving Michael and Laura alone by the creek. She wrapped her arms around him, whispering, "I'm proud of you. You did what you had to do." Michael hugged her back, but inside, a storm was building. He had given in, done what the HOA demanded, and removed the dam. But as he looked at the rushing creek, he thought about the rains that would come again soon. He thought about the flooding that had ruined his garden and seeped into basements. He thought about how the dam had protected them all. Now, without it, the creek was wild again. And sooner or later, the neighborhood would feel it. That night, rain clouds gathered in the distance. Michael sat by the window, listening to the first drops hit the roof. His heart was heavy, but there was also a quiet sense of certainty inside him. He whispered to himself, "Let them see what happens now." Laura heard him but said nothing. She simply placed her hand on his, giving silent support. As the rain fell harder, the creek began to swell. The sound of rushing water grew louder in the dark. Michael watched, knowing that nature was about to remind the HOA of what they had ignored. The breaking point had come, not just for the dam, but for the neighborhood itself. The storm came faster than anyone expected. Dark clouds rolled over the quiet neighborhood, heavy with rain. By evening, the sky opened, and water poured down in steady sheets. The sound of thunder shook the air, and the creek, freed from the dam, began to swell with force. Michael Johnson stood at his window, watching as the rain hammered the earth. His eyes moved to the creek, which had already risen high along its banks. Without the dam to slow it, the water moved fast, dragging twigs, leaves, and broken branches along with it. The calm pond he once loved was gone, replaced by a wild and restless current. Laura stood beside him, worry etched across her face. "Michael," she whispered, "do you think it will hold?" Michael shook his head slowly. "It never held before the dam. That was the reason I built it." By nightfall, the storm grew worse. Rainwater streamed down the streets, filling gutters until they overflowed. The creek raged, climbing higher with every minute. Its roar could be heard above the pounding rain. Across the neighborhood, lights flickered as families peered out their windows, uneasy. Some had lived through flooding before. They remembered the smell of wet carpet, the ruined boxes in their basements, the long weeks of repairs. Others had only heard stories. Now, they were about to see for themselves. Near midnight, the creek spilled over. First, it was just small streams of water slipping through the grass and across yards. Then, with a sudden rush, the banks gave way, and water surged forward, flooding driveways and pouring toward the streets. Michael and Laura stepped outside with umbrellas, watching as the water raced through their neighborhood. It flowed like a river, swallowing sidewalks, crawling up lawns, and pushing against doors. From down the street, voices shouted. A neighbor was rushing to move his car as water rose around its tires. Another family carried sandbags to their front steps, trying to keep the water from entering their home. Children cried as their parents hurried them inside. Laura clutched Michael's arm tightly. "This is worse than before," she said, her voice trembling. Michael's face was grim. "This is what I warned them about. The dam was holding it back. Now the creek is free, and it won't stop." The flood spread quickly. By dawn, the streets were rivers. Cars sat half submerged, their headlights glowing faintly under the rising water. Trash bins floated, bumping against fences and mailboxes. Gardens were drowned, and basements filled with muddy water. The HOA board members, including Robert Smith, were not spared. Robert's pristine lawn was now a small lake. Water pressed against his front door, and pumps struggled to keep his basement from flooding. His perfect order, the rules he had guarded so fiercely, were powerless against the storm. Neighbors gathered in clusters, sharing their frustration. Some carried buckets, some tried to sweep water away, but most simply stood in disbelief. They remembered Michael's dam and could not help but think of how it had once kept the creek calm. By afternoon, when the rain slowed, the damage was clear. Streets were cracked and muddy. Driveways were ruined. Several homes had basements full of water. Yards looked like swamps, and the air smelled of damp earth and wet wood. Martha, the elderly woman who had praised the dam, struggled to keep her basement dry. When Michael came to check on her, she shook her head sadly. "I told them this would happen," she said. "Your dam was our shield. Now look at us." Michael helped her move soaked boxes and comforted her as best as he could. All around the neighborhood, he saw scenes just like hers: families dragging out wet furniture, children crying over ruined toys, neighbors staring at the mess with tired eyes. The next day, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The hall was crowded, the air thick with frustration. People demanded answers, and all eyes turned to Robert Smith and the other board members. Robert cleared his throat and spoke, his voice tight. "This storm was unusual. The flooding was beyond our control. We understand the hardship, and we will be working to organize cleanup efforts." But voices rose from the crowd. "Unusual? "We've had floods before, and Michael's dam stopped them," shouted David, the young father. "That dam protected us," Susan added. "You fined him for it, and now look at our homes." Murmurs of agreement spread quickly. Many neighbors who had stayed silent before were now angry. They had seen the difference with their own eyes. The dam had worked, and without it, the flood had returned. Robert tried to maintain control. The dam was unauthorized. It broke the rules. "We cannot allow structures like that." Martha, her voice shaking but strong, stood up from her seat. "Rules don't keep water out of our basements. That dam did. You punished a man for protecting us. Now we are the ones paying the price." The room erupted with voices. People demanded the fine against Michael be dropped. Some even called for the board to step down. Robert sat stiffly, his face red, as the crowd grew louder. Michael sat quietly near the back of the hall. He had not come to fight. He only wanted the truth to be seen, and now it was. The neighborhood had lived the proof. The dam was never the enemy. The real problem was the stubbornness of the board. When the meeting ended, neighbors gathered around Michael, thanking him again and again. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others asked if he would consider rebuilding the dam if the HOA allowed it. Michael listened quietly. His heart was heavy with the loss of what he had built, but there was also a spark of pride. The flood had shown everyone the truth, even those who had doubted him before. That night, Michael and Laura sat together by the creek once more. The water was lower now, but the damage it had caused was plain to see. Michael ran his hand along a stone from the broken dam, half buried in the mud. Laura looked at him. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Michael gazed at the creek, then at the houses still drying out in the distance. "Now," he said slowly, "they understand. Whether they admit it or not, they know the dam worked. The question is whether they're ready to change." For the first time in weeks, a small smile touched his face. He had lost the battle with the HOA, but the flood had given him something stronger than rules or fines proof. The water had spoken louder than any meeting ever could. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to the neighborhood like damp air. For days, families worked to clean their homes. Rugs were dragged outside to dry in the sun. Furniture was carried to the curb, ruined by the flood. The smell of wet wood lingered, and the sound of pumps echoed from basements. Through it all, Michael Johnson walked quietly from house to house, checking on his neighbors. He helped carry heavy boxes, lifted water-soaked couches, and shared advice from his own years of fixing things. His hands were rough, his back sore, but he gave his time without being asked. Many neighbors, humbled by the flood, began to look at him differently. Where once some had avoided his eyes, now they welcomed him. They shook his hand, thanked him, and admitted what they had not said before: he had been right. Even Robert Smith, the HOA president, could not hide from the truth. His own basement had taken on 3 feet of water. He spent hours hauling ruined belongings to the street. His perfect lawn was torn apart by mud and debris. For the first time, his own house looked no better than anyone else's. But Robert was not a man who liked to admit mistakes. At the next HOA meeting, he spoke carefully. "We understand the frustration," he said. "We will be reviewing policies regarding water management and possible future projects." The words were dry, official, and without apology. Yet the room buzzed with quiet defiance. Neighbors were no longer silent. They had seen how rules had failed them, and how one man's dam had made the difference. Martha, the elderly neighbor, raised her voice. Policies? We don't need more paper. We need solutions. Michael built one with his hands. You took it away, and we all suffered for it. Others agreed, voices rising with hers. The board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The fine against Michael was still on record, but the room made it clear, enforcing it now would only deepen the anger. Finally, one board member suggested what had seemed impossible weeks earlier. Perhaps the dam idea should be reconsidered, properly approved, engineered, and maintained with community support. The crowd murmured. It was not a direct apology, but it was an opening. For Michael, it was enough. After the meeting, neighbors approached him, asking if he would be willing to lead the effort. They wanted him to share his design, his vision. They wanted the creek managed again, this time with official approval. Michael listened, his heart steady. He did not gloat, did not raise his voice in victory. Instead, he nodded and said, if we do this again, it won't be mine alone. It has to belong to everyone. That night, he and Laura sat together on their porch, watching the stars return after so many stormy nights. Laura placed her hand over his. You see? You didn't lose, Michael. You showed them. The flood spoke louder than any argument. Michael smiled faintly. It wasn't the way I wanted it to happen. People lost things. Homes were damaged. But now they know. That's what matters. Weeks passed, and slowly the neighborhood healed. Repairs were made, lawns restored, basements dried. More importantly, trust grew where it had been broken. People worked together, no longer divided by silence or fear of rules. A committee was formed to study creek management, and though Robert Smith remained on the HOA board, his voice was no longer the only one that mattered. Neighbors remembered too clearly what had happened, and they spoke up with strength. Michael was invited to share his notes, his sketches, and his experience. Engineers were later brought in, but even they admitted his design had been effective. What he had built with stones, wood, and clay had held nature in balance until it was torn down. In time, a new project began. It was larger, built with concrete and steel, but its heart was the same as Michael's original dam. The creek was tamed once more, this time with the full approval of the community. On the day the new structure was completed, neighbors gathered to watch the water settle behind it. Ducks returned, children laughed, and the creek flowed calmly again. The memory of the flood remained, but so did the lesson. As people stood around, Martha leaned close to Michael and whispered, "It may have their name on the papers, but we all know who built the first one." Michael chuckled softly. That doesn't matter. What matters is that it's here, and it's helping everyone. Later that evening, when the crowd had gone home, Michael and Laura walked to the edge of the creek together. The new dam reflected the glow of the setting sun, strong and steady. Michael touched the cool concrete and thought of the rough stones he had once carried, the sweat and struggle, the anger and the loss. Yet he felt no bitterness. Instead, he felt peace. His hands had started something, and now it had grown into something bigger than himself. Laura looked at him with gentle pride. You were right from the beginning. Sometimes it takes the hardest storms to show the truth. Michael squeezed her hand and smiled. And sometimes, he said softly, the quietest victories are the ones that last. That night, he sat on the porch, listening to the creek's calm flow. The air was fresh, carrying the sound of frogs and crickets. For the first time in months, he felt truly at rest. The HOA fine was never spoken of again. The letters stopped coming. No apology arrived in his mailbox, but he didn't need one. His victory was not written on paper, it was written in the water, in the safety of his neighbors' homes, and in the peace that finally returned to his heart. The man who had once been fined $10,000 for building a dam now watched his neighborhood thrive because of the very idea they had tried to destroy. And though he never boasted, those who lived there never forgot. When storms came again the next season, the new dam held firm. The creek stayed calm, the streets stayed dry, and the basements stayed safe. Families rested easier, children played by the water without fear, and neighbors spoke of the man who had seen the danger before anyone else. Michael Johnson had not just built a wall of stones and wood. He had built trust, courage, and a lesson that even rules must sometimes bow to wisdom. And in the quiet hum of the water flowing steady and safe, he found the peace he had been seeking all along.